Not all video games are entirely comic, and the ones that are employ measures that aren't always obvious or culturally commonplace. Matthias Arzaki wrote a piece called What Makes Games Funny, and pointed out the occasionally subjective or accidental instances of funny events that can be noticed in otherwise serious video games. And that's why comedy may be better described as a value of structure or narrative than as a genre.
Bite his balls!
Anne-Marie Groenroos wrote her MA thesis entitled Humor in Video Games, Play, Comedy and Mischief, with a broader and more empirical look on the subject. She argues that comedy often channels through different forms of expression, and usually blends in with other generic styles. She outlines three major theories that reflect upon the matter in fiction. The superiority theory, more akin to Aristotle's brief descriptions of comedy as the imitation of the inferior in their maladies, whatever meaning that can convey in distinct contexts.
Who wants some?
The incongruity theory, which examines humor as a breaching of human mental patterns, and the relief theory, which tackles it as an emotional respite for tense situations. The problem is that such comic elements do not function uniformly, and sometimes dissolve when included in certain systems and more often than not interlap in a single system. Likewise, humor in video games can work in various ways. It can be informed through satirical commentaries with a backdrop of comic relief, through full-fledged, dark, sarcastic, sometimes unpopular, explicit content about the manias of society and behavior, through cartoonish adventure formats of interaction with touches of textual comedy, or still through pure silliness pertaining to slapstick modes of showing. MDK belongs in the latter category. It's a game that hacks itself in order to feature its physical wackiness and its humorous references to pop culture, something that has been extensively done in video games.
It's down to you and me, Mr. Fly. You can't evade me forever.
That self-hacking doesn't threaten the game's conceptual integrity because it sets out to avoid any sort of seriousness, be it in mechanics or content exposition, which in turn works as a way to build a concept of its own. Incongruity humor guides most of the crazy content that MDK exposes. It's a game that makes fun of other fiction and of itself. But when and where did the idea for such a unique work start taking shape? Earthworm Jim had already been deemed a successful endeavor in the platformer genre when Nick Bruti and the Shiny Entertainment team came up with the idea for a shooter back in 1996. It was a small team, and between Bruti and lead artist Bob Stevenson, all the ideas about the game's art style, design, levels and special effects came to life. Tim Williams, who would also work alongside Nick and Bob in future projects, was a lead writer. Development was arduous, some ideas were cast aside, and the team had a hard time working around the engine's shortcomings when adding textures and shading. But in late April 1997, MDK went gold and was available for PC users. Review outlets were very much aware of the game's potential back then, and responses varied from flamboyantly enthusiastic to mildly reserved. The sniper mechanics, a remarkable part of combat for its outstanding zoom range and variety of bullet types, left a positive impression on almost all reviewers, even though some overestimated its relevance in the game, mentioning how it could be used as a stealth strategy to approach enemies, which is rarely the case considering how readily responsive the AI is to the player character's presence in both open areas and close quarters. The odd artistic concept of the game was very much appreciated, and for many, it went well with the funny tone of its sequences and the general science fiction themes. Developing a game that should not take itself seriously allowed the team to experiment with chaotic ideas. The strange name chosen for the protagonist, Kurt Hektic, was born out of pop culture. A quote from the 1993 tragicomic film Naked, and the first name from grunge's Ultimate Enfant Terrible. The art was refined to resemble some popular styles, such as H.R. Geiger's work and David Lynch's ill-fated June. Influence from old Spanish armor for decoration and flourish was also present, according to Bruti. A curious fact is that leading up to its release, MDK was being compared to the likes of Doom and Quake, and constantly included in the first-person shooter spectrum. It may be argued that its style was not that widespread at the time, and not necessarily related to 3D shooters, so the third-person perspective would be quickly associated with the FPS viewpoint. Although in practice, it works very similarly, especially seeing as the Y-axis is irrelevant in aiming, as in Duke Nukem 3D and Doom itself. However, by putting the player character within the frame, Shiny set MDK apart from the average FPS, and even more so once one digs deeper into its gameplay and its platformer-like areas. The fact is that the protagonist became the game's utmost icon, which was appropriate considering all the work put into his design. As Brutti himself put it, "I always wanted third person for the platforming elements. I also feel the player is more involved in the world when they can see their own character." Making Kurt Hectic's suit have that style and look that memorable contributed to the action value, whereas his image as an accidental and clumsy hero adds to the game's humor. The jokes, gameplay, perspective, and storyline rendered MDK a bit of a reputation as an anomaly at the time, not necessarily in a negative way. Just as comedy in general is made up of interlapping factors in fiction, genre and form eventually get tricky to pin down. The story is simple and facetious. Dr. Fluke Hawkins is a frustrated scientist aboard the Jim Dandy spaceship, alongside his also frustrated janitor Kurt, and the six-legged robot dog that he builds later named Max. Dr. Hawkins has been aching to tell the world about his upcoming jaw-dropping discovery, a vague cosmic occurrence called flange orbits. He then finds out that the occurrence doesn't exist, but stays in Earth's orbit, hoping to discover something so that his reputation isn't affected. While in the process of waiting for something to show up in space, the Earth is invaded by Stream Riders, robotic aliens that begin violently draining resources from the planet through the use of mine crawlers, enormous slow-moving vehicles that leave only barren soil in their wake. Kurt is hastily turned into a hero and descends towards Earth. The player takes control of him, and the many mine crawlers are the levels to be played through. As commonly done in the late 80s and throughout the 90s, boxed copies brought detailed manuals, which sometimes contained more information about the story world than the mechanisms of exposition of the game themselves, such as dialogue sequences or expensive cutscenes. MDK doesn't have much of either, and relies on peripheral storytelling, such as its relatively thick manual, to make its tale available to those few players interested. The incongruity humor that the game incorporates mostly employs techniques of exaggeration, the sort that mixes elements of physical comedy with fake-looking gore. It also employs, to a lesser extent, techniques of repetition, the sort that goes along with lazy writing for the sake of laughs. That comic blend, the sci-fi environment and aesthetics, the third-person perspective, and the berserk pace make MDK stand out as a memorable title, perhaps resembling those oddly familiar low-budget sci-fi films from the Cold War period that gained notoriety because of their weird tone. The mechanical features are evenly distributed. Chain gun action sections prevail, after all MDK is a shooter before anything else, but sniper-oriented puzzles and problems involving the exploration and breaching of space mechanisms are also plentiful throughout the game. Its frantic gameplay was viewed at the time as revolutionary with a capital R, again thanks to that peculiar third-person shooter style. Besides shooting and sniping, there are moments when the player stumbles upon different styles of combat, which reiterates MDK's proximity to the platformer genre. Dropping bombs from a hovering spaceship or gunfighting enemies on a snowboard, with music and action that parody The Spy Who Loved Me, are some of the alternative ways that Shiny provided to enhance the depth of combat and progression, while cultivating the comic facet of the fiction behind the system. The parachute mechanics makes jumping a strategic addition to strafing and circling. It decelerates falling down and allows for more evasive techniques, as well as a better use of levels of space. You cannot shoot up or down, which is a shame considering how dynamic the sniper view is, for example, but you can jump off and onto ledges to get vantage points from which to envision the environment and pick enemies apart. It doesn't help them that Kurt's chain gun has hit-scan mechanics, while their weapons all fire moving projectiles. And then there are bits in which conflict must be approached passively. Before each level begins, the player descends onto the respective mine crawlers while having to dodge radars that identify intruders and launches missiles at them. No shooting back is allowed, and goodies are also thrown out from the Jim Dandy that will give the player a bit of an upper hand. Why not give Kurt the items before he jumps off the ship, one might ask? And the answer is because challenge and fun topples logic, and that's part of MDK's hilarious chaos. As customary for shooters of the era, power-ups and general items are an alternate but important part of approaching conflict. Some are offensive items, such as simple explosives, breaching mechanisms, or an artificial tornado. Others help in secondary combat strategies, such as decoys or traps that look like snacks. However, the game doesn't feature another crucial component of the 90s shooter formula: arsenal variety. When Kurt is out and about, the chain gun is his only permanent weapon. It can also receive an upgrade called the Super Chain Gun, which increases damage input considerably for a few hundred bullets. But that's about it. Then again, the need for a more space-oriented rationale compensates for the lack of varied weaponry. And the sniper helmet has a considerable array of explosive bullets, mortars, and other deadlier projectiles, all of them having different cadence, damage input and type, or flight path. Level design and level elements are very important in MDK. Each level is divided into submaps that offer a plethora of challenges. Some contain platformer-like trials, some focus on pure combat and mechanics, while others explore movement. And that's an essential asset for MDK. The oversimplified gunplay is redeemed by a creative expansion of the existing game world and interaction. All the different gameplay features are brought to life by the tasks found in these submaps. The sniper mode, the jumping and parachuting combinations, the use of secondary items, or simply strategic alternatives that defy the one-dimensional idea of unavoidable combat accepted in shooters, and give the map exploration nuances of the story world. In this case, using an alert bot as an infiltration tool to move past enemies that would be tough to face head-on. Between the main areas, the player runs through connecting tunnels that can be better described as loading sections. They give the illusion that they're busy sections of the game and sometimes function as mini-games for distraction during mechanically bound moments. And even when nothing happens in these tunnels, the player can feel that there is some sort of engagement in simply running through them. Although the tunnels can also serve as a brief moment of relief for the player before the next grunt-filled room and non-stop shooting, Shiny made sure that many of them wouldn't look forgettable, and offered unique challenges so that the loading process wouldn't only be about running from one room to the next, but about appreciating whatever is in between. MDK values its every room and every underpass, especially considering how short it is. As Kurt arrives at a minecrawler, the player will never feel like the game has little to offer, and will never feel lonely. Some areas are tighter, some have ledges to jump onto, some go downwards. Some submaps have very specific themes, some of them just refuse to conform to any sort of logic. In MDK, levels translate perfectly what the game is all about and what to expect from certain moments. Shiny made such a charming oddity out of gaudy gags in a shooter-platformer hybrid. Self-explanatory slides instead of cutscenes, third-person instead of first-person, incongruity comedy instead of serious action, contextualized tunnels instead of loading screens. There is so much to like in MDK, and there might have been more had the game been a little longer. Although one could argue that being economical with length gave them the opportunity to feature their main ideas more emphatically, and the result was good enough to prove their strategy right. Shiny got recognized for remarkable level design work, challenging and puzzly mechanics, and a unique story world. A sequel would come out 3 years later, developed by BioWare. The devs preserved many of the core elements that made the original installment popular, while including new ingredients, such as the use of Dr. Hawkins and Max as additional player characters, thus managing to repeat the feat and draw positive criticism. The third game has not seen the light of day yet, and since last year, the MDK IP has been up for grabs. Perhaps this is the moment for a third title, 20 years later, when several established values in the video game industry are being challenged. Perhaps it's time for Kurt Hectic, Hawkins and Max to undergo a revival.